What is the truest thing you can think of? I don't mean something just obvious to you. I mean something you believe you can prove true. There's a knock at your door and it's a guy with a big cardboard check for $1 billion and a news crew behind him. And they say that the money is yours if you can make a statement that is irrefutably, undoubtedly true. My name is Sasan Kasravi and I'm a debate coach. I've been doing that for over a decade. I've taught at colleges. I've taught at basically every grade in K through 12. And I think the way argumentation and debate is taught at every level of education is fundamentally ineffective. And my mission, if you want to call it that, is to provide you with the most effective, usable understanding of argumentation that you can get anywhere. That's what I'm seeking to address with the Kasravi model of argumentation, which says that the quality of any argument is derived from its relevance, its accuracy, and its significance. It also means that anytime you're trying to criticize somebody else's argument, you are either saying that that argument isn't relevant, isn't accurate, or isn't significant. Compare that to a model that says you need a claim with some warrants for it. Here, you understand what you're actually trying to establish, or if you're arguing against something, where you should be searching for weaknesses. I think the general public thinks of a very good debater as being somebody who could convince you the sky is red. And I think the reason for that is because we think debate is about uncovering the truth. In fact, if you ask people, why is debate important? They'll tell you some version of, well, debate is a tool we use to uncover the truth. And there's this person here with their opinion and this person here with their opinion. And by having discourse, we discover the truth, which is probably somewhere in between those ideas. I think that's actually a bit of a misconception. I think the concept is admirable and great, but can you actually think of any debate that has happened in history where two sides with different opinions walked in, they landed on a consensus neither of them started with, and that consensus is something that we generally consider to be true? I did a bit of digging into this, and I can't think of a single time that that's actually happened, even though that's what people say this thing is for. In this video, we're going to examine accuracy by taking a look at what the concept of truth is and why it can't play the role in persuasion that we want it to. I just finished editing this video, but I wanted to clarify, the truth matters a lot to me. I'm sure it matters a lot to you too. This video is about what function, if any, truth has in argumentation. Is there a difference between a true argument that convinces people and a false argument that convinces people? In other words, are there any qualities we can look for in an argument to determine that argument is true? It's hard to overstate how important the concept of the truth is to us. In fact, the best available data we have says that once people's sense of security is met, to people in Western society, all of their top values are closely intertwined with this concept of truth. These are things like transparency and rationality and factual accuracy. That's not as often the case in non-Western cultures, but even some thinkers in the Western world have been really critical of how highly we value the truth. One of those thinkers was Friedrich Nietzsche, who dropped a bunch of banger lines about truth, like, "What are man's ultimate truths? Merely his irrefutable errors." He said it in a German accent. He also said, "Truth is the kind of error without which a certain species could not live." What Freddie's talking about here is pragmatic or practical truths. He thinks that people are too cowardly to accept that the most important beliefs to them aren't actually built on good reasoning. But that's not how we think of ourselves. We think of ourselves as being rational people who are willing to face and confront blunt truths. But is that true, really? Let's go back to my opening question. Ed McMahon is still at your door, and now you've had a couple minutes to think about your answer. If I had to guess, the most common answers are going to be either of two things. The most common is probably something like 2 + 2 = 4. And probably in second place is some sort of cleverly phrased sentence like, all things except dogs are not dogs. We can call this approach to truth pure reasoning, where we examine ideas for what must be true and what must not be true. What we call logic in Western tradition is heavily rooted in Greek philosophy, with the first logical statement that many people have been taught for centuries being, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. We started with two things we knew about the world, and we used them together to conclude this other third thing. And so using that system, we can go from knowing a few things to concluding lots and lots of things that we didn't know when we started. The Western tradition of debate is very heavily rooted in ancient academia. And I think the gravitas around debate comes from this era. Because in a world that's only understood through pure reasoning, debate is as important to uncovering the truth as sunlight is to farming. And ancient Greek philosophers used pure reasoning to determine some incredible things about the world. For example, did you know that the word atom comes from a Greek philosopher who used logic to determine that these must be the invisible building blocks of all matter in the universe? Did you know that Aristotle predicted that there would be a large continent at the southern portion of the globe 2,200 years before Antarctica was discovered? Aristotle also determined that men have more teeth than women. Wait, what? Men and women definitely have the same number of teeth, so were just a lot of people missing teeth at the time and it was hard to count? Nope, turns out ancient Greeks had pretty healthy teeth as adults. So what then? How could Aristotle be right about where a continent on the other side of the planet is, but be wrong about the number of teeth his wife has? Well, Bertrand Russell argued that it probably never occurred to him to check. The concept of checking your ideas against observations to see if they're true didn't really develop, even among scholars, for several hundred years after that. We think of it now as common sense, but it's something that needs to be learned and practiced. Okay, but then how did they figure out the atom and Antarctica thing? Well, turns out they weren't right about those things either. Democritus used logic to conclude that things can't just be made out of infinitely smaller and smaller things. You'd never have a place to start from. So he said that there must be some tiny invisible thing that isn't made out of anything else. The word atom means uncuttable. That famously turned out not to be true. Okay, but the basic idea is still right. We have fundamental particles, and that's what atoms are made out of. Well, it turns out that's not really accurate either. Fundamental particles aren't small objects. They are complex fluctuations in a quantum field. Neat. The Antarctica thing. For some reason, Aristotle figured that the world must be perfectly symmetrical, and he figured there's a bunch of land in the north, so there's probably a bunch of land in the south. And it turns out the world isn't perfectly symmetrical, so that's not right either. I'm telling you all of this to tell you how debate lost the function it once had in the world. There was a time where logic made things be true, and debate is just logic in action. But all of that ended with the onset of empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that we determine what's true by making observations. Now, people have always looked at stuff and drawn conclusions. Even Aristotle's considered an early empiricist, aside from the whole tooth debacle. But proper empiricism starts with a guy named Francis Bacon. His work was the foundation for the scientific method, which led to the scientific revolution, which paved the way for the Age of Enlightenment. It's probably not an exaggeration to say that modern thought is founded on the idea that we check things to see if they're true. If you ask someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson how this process reveals things that are true, he'll tell you that it's because it works. We use the scientific method and people end up on the moon. And if you ask most scientific-minded people, they'll tell you this is how they make determinations about what things they believe are true. Ultimately, as debaters, that's what we care about, because we want to have a system we can use to check if our ideas are true, and to know how other people make their determinations about the truth so that we can be persuasive. But here's where the concept of truth starts falling apart. Let's start with pure reason. Because remember, we had that 2 + 2 = 4 thing, and we had everything except dogs is not a dog. What happened to those? Those are true, right? Ultimately, the weakness of pure reasoning is that either it's circular, meaning this sentence is true because it says so, or it's built on dogma, meaning this is true because you're not supposed to question it. Why is it true that all non-dogs are not dogs? Because that's just what those words mean. We put them in a sentence and we didn't contradict ourselves, but it doesn't actually reveal something about reality. It's just a bunch of words we put next to each other. Okay, but what about 2 + 2 = 4? We use math to discover new things about the universe all the time. And there's actually complex proofs to show that 2 + 2 = 4. We're not just saying it does. Well, math is built on dogma. At the very bedrock of math, we have things called primitives and axioms. These are statements that are not only not proven to be true, but are not provable. There's only a handful of them, and they all make perfect intuitive sense, and if you just assume these few things are true, a whole universe of math opens up to you. But they are assumptions that we have to choose to make. In fact, there's other models of math that use different primitives and axioms than we normally use. And in some of those models, 2 + 2 = 1. In fact, sometimes those models better reflect something we see in nature, like quantum mechanics, than our regular math. So there's no real justification we can give why 2 + 2 = 4 is inherently truer than 2 + 2 = 1. Okay, so then we just say something empirically verifiable to Ed McMahon and we get our $1 billion check, right? We tell him, when I clap my hands, it makes a sound. Well, that doesn't actually really work either. There's several problems with empiricism that each have an important implication for argumentation and debate. First off, our observations are famously unreliable. That wasn't really the sound of me clapping my hands, and even if I hadn't replaced the sound, it still wouldn't have been the real sound because it would be your speaker making the sound, and even if it was the real sound of me clapping, then right after you heard it, it would only be a faulty memory of, you get where I'm going with this one. Now, I'm not suggesting here that you go into every argument and say, well, how can we know that that person didn't make a mistake? Because you want to hold your opponents to a standard for proof that your own ideas are able to rise to. But I think it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of things that we generally treat as being more objective than they actually are. For example, there's a significant body of research that says eyewitness testimony is so unreliable it probably shouldn't even be allowed in court. But the problem's deeper than that, because we have technology and computers and stuff, and they make better observations than we do, right? Well, even if we can make perfect observations, that still wouldn't be enough. Let's say you wanted to prove that the Earth is round. Lots of ways to do that. But let's say you wanted to put a camera on a high altitude balloon and send it up high enough to where you can take a video of the curvature of the Earth. Look, it's round. Well, for that to prove that the Earth is round, we have to know a bunch of other things. For example, that the camera's working correctly. And in order to know that the camera's working correctly, we have to know how light works. And in order to know how light works, we have to know something else. And that keeps happening infinitely. One more late addition here. Because what we normally call truth is really just shared assumptions, it's really important when you're trying to persuade someone to first establish what things you already agree on, especially if you're debating in some way that is competitive. Otherwise, it's really easy for any hack 2-bit master debater to just keep asking you what your evidence is, and then your evidence for why that evidence is accurate, and so on, until you inevitably reach a point where you can't give a convincing justification anymore, and then they just write off everything you were saying. And if you try to do the same to them, they'll come up with some excuse for why that's not relevant. In fact, this is why the debaters that we covered in the last video focus so much more on relevance than factual accuracy. What you can do to prepare for this is to recognize what assumptions your ideas rely on and be ready to justify why those assumptions are worth making. You can't prove anything is true without relying on some assumption. Because just like Democritus and the atom, an argument is built on premises, and those premises need to be justified by proving other premises, and it seems to go on infinitely. And the only thing we can put at the bottom as a foundation to hold everything else up is some assumption. We can't objectively prove anything at the foundation. This is what Hans Albert called the Munchausen trilemma. A trilemma is like a dilemma, but it's with 3 things. I don't normally think of a dilemma as being 2 things, but I guess. Anyway, he said that any time you want to prove something is true, you either need to use circular reasoning or rely on dogma or some sort of assumption, or you have to prove an impossible infinite chain of things. This is what Nietzsche is talking about when he says truth is errors without which a certain species cannot live. We can't live our lives without having any beliefs, but there's also no belief that is so true it can't be doubted. This is why when we talk about accuracy in debate, we're always talking about perceived accuracy, not some sort of objective factual truth. Because it's impossible to prove something is true, especially during a structured debate. The best you can do is correctly identify the assumptions that your audience has made or is willing to make. That's not to say that all assumptions are made equal. For the best results in your own life, you should combine empiricism with a few concepts in reasoning. First, don't think of things as being true or false. Think of them as having high or low probability based on how well it conforms to available data. In debate, you can do this by focusing on how the things you're talking about conforms to all sorts of things that your audience already accepts as true, and point out ways in which something your opponent is advocating for clashes with another thing that we generally accept to be true. Second, there's usually multiple explanations for something that don't contradict the available data. There's a logical principle called Occam's razor that says, in those instances, you should prefer the simplest answer. Now, it's hard in a debate to prove that your explanation is simpler than your opponent's, but what this means practically for you is that in an instance where you can't contradict anything your opponent is saying and they can't contradict anything you're saying, your goal should be to make sure that the way you're conveying your idea to your audience comes across as simpler and easier to understand rhetorically. Finally, there's the idea of falsifiability. There's a lot of things that no one believes, but we can't actually demonstrate are false. Carl Sagan uses the example of an invisible dragon in his garage that you also can't touch or smell. We can't demonstrate that this dragon isn't there, but falsifiability says that the very fact that we can't contradict the claim is why we should toss it out. In other words, the best ideas are the ones that should be easy to contradict in theory if they were false, but nothing is contradicting them in our observations. This is a hugely important thing to assess, especially when you're trying to persuade a specific person that you're arguing against. Have them explain your position and echo it all back to them. Say it back in your own words until they agree that you correctly understand what their belief is. And then you can ask them, what would change your mind? What would cause you to doubt this thing that you believe? What would it take? The more rational their belief is, the easier it'll be for them to say, well, if you could demonstrate X, Y, or Z, then I would have a reason to doubt this. The less rational it is, the more they'll be like, nothing can make me doubt this. And at that point, you would just be wasting your breath debating against that person. Combined, these give us the best model we can probably use to determine if something in the world is true. It's what I call the naive formula for accuracy. The accuracy of a claim is measured by how falsifiable it is times how much it fits the observations that we have times how much we've observed that thing. Now, these aren't real numbers. I just want you to imagine some relative higher or lowerness. And the reason I'm saying times instead of plus is so that if any of these values are really low or zero, the end result you get from the formula also becomes zero. For example, we can be very confident in our understanding of where the moon is going to be. In 1981, we developed a model that has correctly predicted every solar eclipse since, down to the exact second it's happened. And the model is expected to be accurate to that level of accuracy for the next 1 to 200 years. All it would take to disprove the accuracy of this model is for a single solar eclipse to be observed somewhere, even a single second off from when it's predicted to be. But that's never happened. So we can be very confident that this thing is true. I call this a naive formula, but it's not because there's some better formula someone's come up with. This is the model that the greatest minds and scholars in the world use to determine all the things that they're most confident about in the world. So then, what makes it naive? It's naive because even after I've told you how to do this, you're not going to use it to arrive at your beliefs. I'm not going to either. No one does. Wikipedia's list of cognitive biases is so long it would take me an hour to read the list out loud, let alone come up with strategies for how we can prevent each of these from happening. So, okay, maybe a scientist can have weird beliefs personally, but at least the work they do is effectively using this formula, right? Except, how can any scientist know that the data they're using for their conclusions is accurate? How can they know that any study they're relying on isn't just a lie? The naive formula for accuracy is naive because in reality, our entire perception of truth is at the mercy of journalism. I mean journalism here in the sense of news organizations and science journals and just any instance of getting our information from someone else. Pretty much every belief you have is rooted in or reinforced by information you got from somewhere else. And even though we don't think of this as being what happens in our brains, we get a bunch of data that turns into beliefs and a bunch of data that we throw out, and the best psychological research we have available says that logic doesn't play much of a role in it. We go back and come up with logical reasons why we made certain conclusions, but as we're arriving at those beliefs, logic isn't really at the wheel. At the end of the day, because we're so much at the mercy of other people for the information we have, truth is really just a product of trust. The idea that what makes an argument accurate is effectively just how much the audience trusts the speaker, has huge implications. We're going to explore those implications in my next video, where we talk about what actually generates trust. Along the way, we're going to talk about bias in journalism, credibility, why AI hallucinates and how humans aren't all that different, George Orwell, the psychology of self-deception, and con artists, as we finish this deep dive into the role of accuracy in argumentation. In the meantime, I'll be in the comments, and I look forward to chatting with you. Please subscribe to the channel. Until next time.